Did you know that the night before his death, Jesus revealed something so shocking that most people still misunderstand it completely today? You were taught that love means kindness, patience, and gentle words. But that night completely shattered everything you think you know about love. Because in a quiet upper room, hidden from the noise of the world, something far more dangerous than kindness was unfolding slowly. It was not soft, it was not safe, and it was not anything like the version of love you were taught to believe. On that night, Jesus did not simply talk about love, he redefined it in a way that still unsettles human understanding even now. He broke bread before them calmly, but it was no longer just bread, and its meaning would echo across history without being fully understood. He poured wine into the cup, and what he declared next carried a weight that no one sitting there could fully grasp. And while his disciples watched quietly, confused and uncertain, history itself was already shifting beneath their feet in ways they could not see. You might think you already know this story well, but here is the truth that most people never truly stop to consider deeply. The Last Supper was not just a meal shared among friends, and it was not simply a farewell before something tragic happened. It was a moment where love took a form that feels uncomfortable, unsettling, and even difficult for most people to accept honestly. Because real love, the kind revealed that night, is not about comfort, but about sacrifice that goes far beyond what humans naturally accept. And this is exactly where most people misunderstand everything from the very beginning without even realizing their mistake at all. They imagine power, victory, and visible glory. But what actually happened looked like weakness, humility, and complete surrender to something greater. That contradiction is not accidental, because it is exactly where the deepest truth of that night is carefully hidden from easy understanding. Echo is off. Instead, they saw a man preparing himself quietly to give everything away, without resistance, without force, and without any visible sign of control. Not partially, not symbolically, but completely, and without holding anything back for himself in that decisive moment. And that is the point where everything begins to change in a way that no one in that room could fully understand yet. Because if you truly understand what happened in that room, it will challenge how you see power, success, and even your own purpose in life. The story you are about to hear is not simply a historical event that happened long ago and no longer matters today. It is something far more personal, far more direct, and far more uncomfortable than most people are willing to admit honestly. It acts like a mirror placed directly in front of you, reflecting not only what happened, but also who you truly are inside. And whether you realize it now or not, you are already standing inside that story in ways you may not expect at all. The real question is not what happened that night in history, because that part has already been told many times before. The real question is whether you are ready to understand what it actually means for you right now in your own life. Because once you begin to understand it clearly, nothing will ever feel as simple or as comfortable as it once did before. And everything begins with a world that was already under pressure, waiting for something far greater than anyone could clearly see coming. Before that night ever happened, the world around Jesus was already filled with tension, expectation, and a deep sense of unfinished destiny. The land of Israel was no longer free because it lived under the heavy control of the Roman Empire, which ruled with power and constant surveillance. Roman soldiers walked through the streets daily, not just as protectors of order, but as reminders that freedom had been taken away. People continued their lives, working, praying, and raising families. But inside their hearts, something restless refused to remain silent any longer. They carried a promise passed down through generations, a belief that one day God would send a deliverer to restore everything that was broken. This figure was not imagined as a teacher or a servant, but as a powerful king who would rise and reclaim their nation completely. Every year, this hope grew stronger during one specific moment that defined their identity more than anything else in their history. That moment was the Passover, a sacred celebration that reminded them of a time when God had already set them free once before. Families gathered together, sharing meals filled with meaning, remembering how their ancestors escaped slavery through divine intervention and protection. The lamb, the unleavened bread, and the shared cup were not random elements, but powerful symbols of survival, identity, and divine promise. Each detail carried a story, and each story reinforced the belief that God had not abandoned them, even in difficult times. But here is something most people overlook when they think about that moment in history and its deeper significance. The Passover was not just about remembering the past, it was about expecting something to happen again in the future. It created anticipation, a quiet but powerful belief that another act of salvation was coming, even if no one knew exactly when. At the center of all this expectation stood Jesus, a man who had already spent nearly 3 years changing everything people thought they understood. He walked among ordinary people, teaching with authority, healing the sick, and speaking about a kingdom that did not operate like any earthly system. Crowds followed him everywhere, not only because of what he did, but because of something deeper they could feel but could not explain. Yet not everyone welcomed him, because the more he spoke, the more he challenged ideas that people had held onto for generations. Religious leaders began to feel uneasy because his influence grew quickly and people started listening to him more than to them. What started as concern slowly turned into fear, and fear eventually became quiet plans formed behind closed doors in secrecy. They believed removing him would restore order and protect their authority without realizing they were stepping into something far beyond their control. At the same time, his disciples stayed close to him, walking beside him daily, yet still misunderstanding the true direction of his mission. They imagined a future filled with power, recognition, and victory, believing they were following someone who would soon change everything visibly. But deep inside, their understanding remained incomplete, shaped more by expectation than by the reality unfolding before them slowly. As the Passover approached, Jerusalem became crowded with people arriving from different regions, each carrying their own hopes and expectations. The city felt alive, but beneath that energy was a tension that no one could fully explain or clearly define. It was as if something invisible was already moving, preparing to reveal itself at the exact moment history required. Religious devotion filled the streets, but political pressure and uncertainty lingered quietly just beneath the surface of everything. People sensed something was about to happen, even if they could not understand what it was or how it would unfold. And right in the middle of that tension, something was already being prepared in silence, away from the noise of the crowd. Because what looked like an ordinary celebration was about to become the most important turning point in human history. A moment where everything people believed would be tested, challenged, and completely redefined in a way no one expected. And it all began with a simple instruction that seemed ordinary, yet carried a meaning far deeper than anyone realized. As the Passover drew closer, Jesus did not act randomly or emotionally, but moved with a calm precision that revealed something deeper was already unfolding. He sent 2 of his disciples ahead into the city with instructions that sounded simple, yet strangely specific and almost impossible to predict naturally. They were told to follow a man carrying a jar of water, something unusual because that task was typically reserved for women in that culture. This detail may seem small, but it immediately set the moment apart, signaling that what was happening was guided, not accidental or ordinary. The disciples obeyed without questioning, even though they could not fully understand the purpose behind such a strange and specific instruction. And just as Jesus had said, everything happened exactly as described, as if the path had already been prepared long before they arrived. The man led them through the crowded streets, away from the noise, into a house that seemed quiet, hidden, and already waiting for them. Inside, they discovered an upper room, fully furnished and prepared, as if it had been set aside for this exact moment. Nothing was missing, nothing was out of place, and everything carried a quiet sense of anticipation that could not be easily explained. It was not just a room, it felt like a space separated from time, where something far greater than a simple meal was about to occur. This is where most people miss something important that completely changes how you understand what was about to happen next. Nothing about this preparation was accidental, and nothing was left to chance or human improvisation in any part of the process. Every movement, every instruction, and every detail revealed that something intentional was unfolding beneath the surface of visible events. What seemed ordinary to the disciples was actually part of a much larger design that had been quietly forming over time. And this is where the tension begins to build, not through noise or chaos, but through silence and quiet certainty. Because Jesus knew exactly what was coming, and instead of avoiding it, he stepped toward it with complete awareness and control. There was no hesitation in his actions, no sign of fear, and no attempt to escape what he knew would happen soon. Instead, everything he did that evening carried a sense of purpose, as if each step was leading directly towards something unavoidable. The table was prepared with unleavened bread and wine, elements that had been used for generations in the Passover celebration. To the disciples, this looked familiar, something they had seen many times before without expecting anything different to happen. But beneath that familiarity, something entirely new was about to emerge, hidden inside the gestures they thought they already understood. The bread represented haste and liberation, reminding them of a night when their ancestors left slavery behind without delay. The wine represented joy and covenant, symbolizing a relationship between God and his people that had endured through generations. These symbols carried history, identity, and meaning, but on that night, they were about to be transformed completely. What had always pointed backward toward the past was now about to point forward toward something entirely new and eternal. And this transformation would not be explained in long speeches, but revealed through simple actions that would change everything forever. The atmosphere in that room grew still, as if even time itself slowed down to witness what was about to happen next. The noise of the city remained outside, but inside, there was a quiet intensity that made everything feel heavier and more significant. It was a moment suspended between what had always been and what was about to begin, a threshold between two realities. And right there, in that stillness, Jesus prepared not just a meal, but an offering that would redefine the meaning of sacrifice itself. He was not simply sharing food, he was preparing to give something far greater than anyone in that room could comprehend yet. Because what was about to happen would not only change that night, but would reshape the entire course of human history forever. And it would begin with a simple gesture that seemed familiar, yet carried a meaning no one was prepared to understand. As the meal unfolded in quiet stillness, nothing appeared unusual at first, yet something invisible was already shifting beneath the surface of every action. Jesus took the bread into his hands slowly, not as a routine gesture, but with a deliberate calm that drew attention without needing words. He gave thanks, just as he had done many times before, yet this moment carried a weight that no one in that room could fully explain. Then he broke the bread, and in that simple action, something ordinary began to cross into something deeply sacred and irreversible. The disciples watched closely, but they did not yet understand that they were witnessing a moment that would echo across all generations. Because what happened next was not symbolic in the way they expected, and it was not meant to remain just a memory. With a voice both gentle and firm, Jesus spoke words that would challenge human understanding for centuries to come. He said that this bread was his body, not as a metaphor, but as a reality hidden within something that still looked unchanged. This is where everything begins to feel uncomfortable, because it does not fit within the limits of normal human reasoning or expectation. The disciples may not have fully understood, but they felt something shift, something deeper than explanation, something they could not ignore. In that moment, the familiar became unfamiliar, and what seemed simple became layered with a meaning far beyond appearance. Then he took the cup of wine, holding it with the same calm intention, as if every movement carried a purpose already decided. He gave thanks again, and when he spoke, his words carried a sense of finality that made the atmosphere even heavier. He declared that this cup was his blood, the blood of a new covenant that would not be broken like those before. This was not just about tradition anymore, and it was not simply a continuation of what had always been done before. It was a complete transformation, a shift from remembering past deliverance to participating in something happening in real time. The old meaning of the Passover was not erased, but fulfilled in a way that changed its direction completely. No longer centered on the past alone, it now pointed toward a sacrifice that was about to unfold before their eyes. And here is where the second great misunderstanding begins for most people who hear this story for the first time. They think this moment was about ritual, about religion, or about something distant from everyday life and human experience. But what actually happened was far more personal, far more direct, and far more demanding than any ritual could ever be. Because Jesus was not offering an idea, he was offering himself, completely, without holding anything back for his own protection. This kind of love is difficult to accept because it removes control, removes safety, and replaces them with surrender. The command that followed made it even more clear that this moment was not meant to remain in that room alone. He told them to do this in memory of him, but this memory was not about recalling the past like a distant event. It was about making that same reality present again, again, and again, across time, across places, across generations. This means that what began in that room did not end there, and it continues in ways that many people overlook today. The bread and the wine were no longer just reminders, but became a living connection to something that transcends time itself. And this is where the tension reaches its peak, because what looks simple on the outside carries something immeasurable within. The disciples sat there, holding something they could not fully understand, yet already participating in something greater than themselves. They were no longer just followers. They were witnesses to a reality that would redefine everything they thought they knew. And yet, even in that moment, they still did not fully grasp what it would cost, or what would happen next. Because what began as a meal was already becoming a sacrifice, even before the first step toward the cross had taken place. And that is the moment where love stops being an idea and becomes something that demands everything in return. After those words were spoken, the atmosphere in the room did not relax, but became even heavier, as if something irreversible had just been set into motion. The disciples were not celebrating, and they were not fully understanding, yet they could feel that something had changed in a way they could not explain. Because what Jesus had just done was not only an act of love, but the beginning of something that would continue long after that night ended. When he told them to do this in memory of him, he was not simply asking them to remember, but to participate in the same mystery again. This is where a second layer of meaning begins to unfold, one that most people overlook when they hear this story for the first time. He was entrusting them with a role, not as observers, but as participants who would carry forward what he had just revealed. That moment quietly became the foundation of something that would shape generations, even though it appeared small and almost unnoticed at the time. The apostles were not given power in the way the world understands power, through control, dominance, or visible authority over others. Instead, they were given the responsibility to make present something invisible, something that could not be measured or controlled by human strength. This responsibility was not about elevating themselves, but about allowing something greater to work through them in ways they could not fully control. And this is where the idea of priesthood begins, not as a position of status, but as a continuation of what Jesus himself had done. The one who stands at the table does not act alone, but becomes an instrument through which something beyond him is made present. When the words are spoken again, it is not merely repetition, but participation in the same act that began in that upper room. This is difficult to understand because it challenges the idea that everything must be visible, measurable, and fully explained to be real. But that night was never about what could be seen clearly. It was about what could only be received through trust and surrender. And here is where another misunderstanding often appears, especially for those who approach this story only from a surface level. They assume this moment created a system, a structure, or an institution built on authority and control over others. But what actually began was something far more demanding, far more personal, and far more costly than any system could contain. Because the one who carries this role is not lifted above others, but called to descend into service in a way that mirrors what Jesus did. This is why the meaning of that night cannot be separated from what would happen next, because both are part of the same reality. The table and the cross are not separate events, but two expressions of the same act of complete self-giving. To receive what Jesus gave is to also enter into the same movement of giving, even when it is uncomfortable or misunderstood. And that is exactly what the disciples were not yet ready to fully accept, even though they were already part of it. They still imagined a future of recognition, influence, and visible success, shaped by what they thought power should look like. But what they were being given would lead them in a completely different direction, one that would strip away those expectations completely. Because true participation in what Jesus began that night requires letting go of control, certainty, and even personal ambition. It requires becoming available, not for personal gain, but for something that moves through you for the sake of others. And this is where the meaning becomes deeply personal, because it is not limited to those in that room, or to a specific group in history. It extends outward, touching every person who encounters this story and begins to understand what it actually demands. Because what was handed over that night was not just a ritual, and not just a responsibility given to a few chosen individuals. It was an invitation, quiet but powerful, to step into a way of living that reflects the same kind of self-giving love. And that invitation still remains, waiting, even now, for anyone willing to see beyond the surface and understand what it truly means. In the middle of that solemn meal, just as everything seemed to follow a sacred rhythm, something completely unexpected interrupted the flow of the evening. Jesus stood up quietly from the table, not with urgency or confusion, but with a calm intention that immediately drew attention from everyone present. Without explaining his actions, he removed his outer garment slowly, as if preparing for something that no one in that room could anticipate. Then he took a towel, wrapped it around himself, and began to move in a way that made the atmosphere suddenly tense and uncertain. The disciples watched in silence, unsure whether to speak or remain still, as something unfamiliar began to unfold before their eyes. Because what he was about to do was not just surprising, it was completely outside the boundaries of what they believed was appropriate. He knelt down, not as a teacher, not as a leader, but in the position of someone who serves without recognition or honor. And then, one by one, he began to wash the feet of his disciples, performing a task reserved for the lowest servant in any household. This was not symbolic in the way they expected, and it was not a gesture they could easily accept without internal resistance. Because in their world, hierarchy mattered, roles were clear, and someone in his position would never lower himself in such a way. Yet here he was, doing exactly that, without hesitation, without explanation, and without concern for how it might be perceived. This is where the tension in the room becomes almost unbearable, because what they are seeing does not align with what they believe. They had followed him as a master, a teacher, someone they expected would rise into visible authority and power over others. But now, that expectation was being dismantled in front of them, replaced with something that felt almost uncomfortable to accept. When he came to Peter, the tension finally broke, because Peter could not remain silent in the face of what he was witnessing. He questioned the action, not out of rebellion, but out of confusion, because it did not make sense within his understanding of honor and respect. To him, this act felt wrong, not because it lacked meaning, but because it contradicted everything he believed about leadership and authority. And this is where another deeper truth begins to emerge, one that most people still struggle to accept even today. Because the problem was not the act itself, but the inability to receive something that requires humility to understand fully. Jesus responded, not with anger, but with clarity, revealing that this was not just about service, but about connection and transformation. He made it clear that unless this act was accepted, the relationship itself could not be fully realized or understood. This shifts everything, because it shows that love is not only about giving, but also about allowing yourself to receive. And that is often the harder part, because receiving requires letting go of control, pride, and the need to remain independent. Peter, realizing the weight of this moment, moved from resistance to openness, showing how quickly understanding can begin to change. But the lesson did not stop there, because what Jesus did was not meant to remain a one-time act observed and then forgotten. After completing the washing, he explained that this was an example, something they were now called to repeat in their own lives. Not as a ritual, not as a performance, but as a way of living that reflects a completely different definition of greatness. Because in that moment, greatness was redefined, not as rising above others, but as choosing to go lower in service to them. This is the kind of truth that challenges everything, because it removes the illusion that power comes from control or recognition. Instead, it reveals that real influence comes from humility, from willingness to serve, and from choosing others over yourself. And this is exactly why this moment feels so uncomfortable, because it goes against the natural instincts that most people live by. It asks you to reconsider everything you believe about success, status, and what it truly means to lead others in any area of life. Because if this is true, then everything changes, not just in that room, but in every situation where you choose how to act. And that is why this act, simple on the surface, continues to challenge anyone who takes the time to truly understand it. As the meal continued after that shocking act of humility, the atmosphere did not return to normal, but grew even heavier with an unseen tension. Something had shifted inside the room, something deeper than confusion, something that touched every person present without being clearly spoken aloud. Then Jesus broke the silence with words that immediately unsettled everyone, revealing a truth that no one expected to hear that night. He said that one of them would betray him, not as a distant possibility, but as something already set in motion within that very room. The disciples looked at each other, confused and uneasy, because the idea felt impossible and yet strangely believable at the same time. This was not an accusation directed at one person openly, but a revelation that exposed something hidden within every human heart. And this is where the story becomes deeply personal, because their reaction reflects something that exists in all of us as well. Each of them began to question quietly, asking if they could be the one, revealing an awareness of their own weakness and limitation. They were not certain of their innocence, and that uncertainty revealed how fragile human confidence truly is under pressure. Because deep down, each of them understood something uncomfortable, that even loyalty can fail when fear begins to take control. Among them sat Judas, appearing no different from the others, yet already carrying a decision that had been growing silently within him. His betrayal did not begin in that moment, but had been forming over time through choices that slowly shaped his direction. And this is where another difficult truth emerges, because betrayal rarely happens suddenly, but develops quietly before it becomes visible. Jesus knew exactly what was happening, yet he did not expose Judas publicly or forcefully stop what was about to unfold. Instead, he allowed the moment to continue, respecting a freedom that would lead to rejection, even though it carried deep pain. Then something unexpected happened again, something that makes this moment even more difficult to understand fully. Jesus offered Judas a piece of bread, a gesture of closeness, friendship, and acceptance even in the face of betrayal. This act reveals a level of love that goes beyond fairness, beyond logic, and beyond what most people are capable of giving. Because instead of withdrawing, he continued to give, even knowing that what he offered would not be returned in the same way. And this is where the tension reaches a deeper level, because it challenges the idea that love should always be protected or deserved. At the same time, he turned to Peter, who had confidently believed that his loyalty would never fail under any circumstance. Yet Jesus revealed that Peter would deny him, not once, but multiple times before the night even came to an end completely. This was not said to condemn him, but to reveal something important about the limits of human strength and confidence. Even the most devoted can falter, not because they lack sincerity, but because fear can override intention in critical moments. And this is where the story becomes impossible to ignore, because it reflects something true about every person listening to it now. We often believe we are stronger than we are, more consistent than we are, and more faithful than we actually prove to be. But under pressure, in moments of uncertainty, those assumptions can break down faster than we ever expect or prepare for. The disciples were not villains, and they were not uniquely flawed, but they were human in the same way that we are today. Their story is not distant from ours, but closely connected, revealing patterns that repeat across time in different forms. Yet in the middle of all this weakness, something even more important stands out clearly and cannot be ignored. Jesus did not withdraw his love, did not become distant, and did not change his actions based on their coming failures. Instead, his love remained steady, consistent, and present, even when surrounded by betrayal, denial, and uncertainty. This reveals the core truth of that night, not about human failure, but about a love that does not depend on human perfection. And that is what makes this moment so powerful, because it shows that even in weakness, something greater is still at work. As that night came to an end, what happened in that upper room did not disappear, but continued to unfold across generations in ways many people overlook. What began as a single evening slowly became a pattern, a rhythm, and a living tradition that carried the same meaning forward through time. The early followers of Jesus did not treat that moment as a memory alone, but as something they were called to live repeatedly in their own communities. They gathered together, not simply to recall what happened, but to enter into it again through actions that reflected what they had received. This is where the story moves beyond history and becomes something active, something that continues even in the present moment today. Because the meaning of that night was never meant to stay confined to one place, one group, or one specific moment in time. Instead, it expanded, taking form in practices that carried both visible actions and invisible meaning at the same time. One of the most important expressions of this continuity is found in the gathering that mirrors that original meal shared in silence. In that gathering, the same elements appear again, bread and wine, simple and familiar, yet carrying a depth that goes beyond appearance. To someone observing from the outside, it may seem repetitive, structured, or even predictable in its form and sequence. But beneath that surface, something deeper is being remembered, re-entered, and experienced in a way that words alone cannot fully describe. This is why the tradition continues, not because of habit, but because it carries something essential that people still need today. Over time, other elements became part of this living expression, each carrying its own meaning connected to what began that night. There are moments where oil is blessed and used, not as decoration, but as a sign of healing, preparation, and transformation. These actions may seem small, yet they connect present moments to something that extends far beyond immediate understanding. And this is where the second misunderstanding often appears, especially for those who see only the external form of these practices. They assume these traditions are empty routines, repeated without meaning, disconnected from real life and personal experience. But in reality, each gesture, is rooted in something that continues to shape how people understand love, sacrifice, and connection. There are also moments where leaders renew their commitments, not as a performance, but as a return to the purpose that defines their role. This renewal is quiet, often unnoticed, yet it reflects the same movement that began in that upper room long ago. It is not about perfection, but about returning again, even after failure, to something that calls for continued faithfulness. As the day progresses, the focus shifts from celebration to reflection, from visible action to quiet presence and waiting. There are times of silence, times where nothing seems to happen externally, yet something internal begins to take shape gradually. People remain, not out of obligation, but out of a desire to stay close to something they do not want to lose. This stillness reflects that original night, when everything slowed down and something deeper began to unfold quietly. Even the environment changes, becoming simpler, more stripped, as if removing distractions to reveal what truly matters beneath everything else. This transition is not accidental, but intentional, guiding attention away from comfort and towards something more serious and reflective. Because what began as a meal now leads towards something far more difficult, something that requires attention, patience, and openness. And this is where the meaning of tradition becomes clear, not as repetition, but as preparation for something deeper. Each action, each moment, and each pause serves as a step, leading from understanding into participation and personal reflection. It invites people not just to observe, but to enter into a process that challenges how they see themselves and their choices. And this is why these traditions continue, not because they are required, but because they still speak to something unresolved within us. Because what happened that night was never meant to stay in the past, but to continue shaping how people live and respond even now. Now here is the part that most people try to avoid, because it is no longer about history, tradition, or understanding, but about you personally. Everything that happened that night was not meant to stay in the past, and it was not meant to remain safely inside religious explanation. It was meant to reach forward, to confront you directly, and to ask something that most people are not ready to answer honestly. Because if what happened in that room is true, then it changes how you define love, power, and the way you choose to live. It means love is not just something you feel or talk about, but something that demands action, even when it costs you something real. And this is where most people step back, not because they do not understand, but because they understand just enough to feel uncomfortable. Because it is easier to admire love than to live it, easier to talk about sacrifice than to actually practice it in daily life. Yet that night was never about admiration, and it was never about creating something distant that people could observe safely. It was about invitation, a direct call to step into the same pattern of living that Jesus revealed through his actions. To serve when it is inconvenient, to give when it feels unfair, and to remain present even when others walk away from you. This kind of love does not protect your image, does not guarantee recognition, and does not promise immediate results or reward. Instead, it asks you to let go of control, to release the need to always be right, and to choose others even when it feels difficult. And this is why many people avoid it, because it challenges the very structure of how we naturally think about success and security. We are taught to protect ourselves, to build boundaries, and to ensure that our efforts always return something measurable. But what was revealed that night moves in the opposite direction, asking for something that cannot always be measured or controlled. It asks you to give without knowing the outcome, to forgive without guarantee, and to remain faithful without immediate reward. And here is the truth that most people quietly realize but rarely say out loud in their daily lives. We all want to be loved in that way, but we hesitate when it is our turn to love others the same way. We expect patience, understanding, and forgiveness from others, yet struggle to offer those same things consistently ourselves. That tension is not accidental, because it reveals the gap between what we believe and how we actually choose to live. The disciples experienced that same tension, and their story reflects the same struggle that continues in every generation today. They failed, they doubted, and they hesitated. Yet their story did not end in failure, but continued into something greater over time. Because what matters is not perfection, but whether you are willing to return, to learn, and to continue moving forward. And this is where the invitation becomes real, not as a theory, but as a decision that shapes your actions every single day. It is found in small choices, in quiet moments, in how you respond when no one is watching and nothing forces you to act. It is present when you choose patience instead of reaction, understanding instead of judgment, and presence instead of avoidance. These moments may seem small, but they are exactly where that night continues to live and unfold in real life. Because the meaning of that night is not locked in the past, it is active, present, and waiting to be lived through your choices. And this is the part most people never fully realize, because they stop at understanding and never move into action. But once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it, and you cannot return to living the same way without noticing the difference. Because now the story is no longer just something you heard, it is something you are part of whether you choose it or not. And the only question that remains is simple, but difficult enough to change everything if you answer it honestly. Will you walk away and leave it as a story, or will you step into it and allow it to reshape how you live completely?